Good afternoon. Last night, the Senate of Canada passed into law Bill C-48, the tanker ban, a prejudicial attack on Alberta, and Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law. Alberta has spent over the past year, together with other provinces, industry groups, and dozens of First Nations, opposing these two attacks on our economy, which will undermine investor certainty and which also undermine national unity and the exclusive power of the provinces. I believe that both of these bills are unconstitutional. That's why, within hours of becoming Premier, I appeared before the Senate Transportation Committee to plead with them to kill Bill C-48, the ban on the export of Alberta bitumen from Canada's northwest coast. This is a bill, I think this is perhaps a first in Canadian history, when the federal parliament has passed a bill attacking a major export product of only one province, the province of Alberta, with only one product that is produced in Canada, bitumen produced only in Alberta. This is a prejudicial, discriminatory attack on this province. It has absolutely no defensible rationale, no scientific basis. No studies were presented to support it at the Senate, and this is a bill that would be unthinkable in a different context. As I said to the Senate Transport Committee, imagine a federal government at a time of real sensitivity and national unity in Quebec, bringing in a bill to ban the export of Quebec hydroelectricity or airplanes, for example. It would be unthinkable. And that's why I believe the Senate Transportation Committee heard our plea and recommended to the Senate that it too kill Bill C-48. However, it was revived in the Senate, sent back to the House of Commons, and last night was passed and is now awaiting royal assent. We will launch or support an immediate constitutional challenge to Bill C-48. We will seek partners amongst First Nations whose own opportunity to move to prosperity is undermined by this indefensible bill. We know, for example, that the Niska First Nation, with a modern treaty on BC's northwest coast, wanted the possibility to create a port, in part, to export responsibly produced Canadian energy, but their treaty rights are being undermined by this bill. So too is the Eagle Spirit Consortium of First Nations in northern British Columbia. We'll stand by them with our new $10 million litigation fund to help defend the rights of First Nations to pursue opportunity to help move their people from poverty to prosperity. Bill C-69 was also passed last night, absent about 3/4 of the amendments that had been the constructive and sensible amendments that had originally been made to that bill by the Senate. The Senate earlier this month had adopted all of the amendments proposed by the previous government of Alberta, as well as almost all of those proposed in a constructive spirit by major industry groups like the Association of Petroleum Producers and the Energy Pipeline Association. However, the Trudeau government decided to gut that bill, which had been rewritten to allow for investor confidence, to remove political interference from the environmental assessment process, to respect provincial jurisdiction, to prevent endless frivolous interventions by foreign-funded special interests. All of those amendments were rejected, and consequently, the bill that was passed last night is completely unacceptable to the government of Alberta. It is also opposed by 9 of the 10 provinces, almost every major employer group in Canada, and dozens of First Nations. And that is why we too are preparing to launch an immediate constitutional challenge of Bill C-69. One of the reasons it is so offensive to this province is because it constitutes a clear violation of our exclusive constitutional jurisdiction to regulate the production of our own natural resources, including upstream oil and gas. Rights that were written into the Constitution in 1982 in Section 92A as a condition precedent to Alberta's concurrence with the adoption of the 1982 Constitution Act. Peter Lougheed would not have signed the Constitution. He would have stayed outside of it like René Lévesque had we not won that essential power now being undermined by the Trudeau government in Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines law. We believe we have strong legal grounds upon which to launch that challenge. Let me thank those senators who played a constructive role in these issues over the past year, those who put in thousands of hours listening to witness testimony, becoming experts on these complex issues. The senators at the Transport Committee who recommended the deletion of the tanker ban on bitumen, the members of the entire Senate for the 188 constructive amendments they earlier adopted on Bill C-69. Let me thank the 46 senators who voted no to Bill C-48 at third reading last night, including 5 of the Alberta senators. But I'm profoundly disappointed that Senator Grant Mitchell voted in favor of a bill that he must know is a prejudicial attack on this province. I'd also like to thank the 37 senators who voted last night against the No More Pipelines law, Bill C-69, in its final form. In particular, I would like to thank and congratulate Senators Black and Tanis, both of whom were elected, and Senator Elaine McCoy for having so vigorously stood up for Alberta and for resource jobs in Canada. However, I'm deeply disappointed that Alberta Senators Mitchell, Laboucaine-Benson, and Simons voted in favor of Bill C-69 in its final form. How strange it is that we had senators from Ontario and Quebec voting more clearly for Alberta's interests on this than Alberta senators. This is why I've instructed our House Leader to bring forward on an accelerated basis a Alberta Senate Election Act. Last night's votes clearly demonstrated that elected senators who have a direct line of accountability to Alberta voters are much more likely to vote to defend our vital strategic and economic interests. And the Senatorial Election Act that had been brought in, I believe in 1989, lapsed last year. We will, in this spring-summer session, bring forward a renewed version of the Alberta Senate Election Act in order to give Alberta voters the power to choose the people who they think should represent them in the upper chamber in October of 2021, concurrent with the municipal elections. Finally, let me say that the passage of these 2 bills brings us much closer to holding a referendum on equalization. This was a key commitment in our campaign platform, that if the federal government proceeded with unacceptable versions of these 2 bills, attacks on our vital economic interests, and if we did not get a coastal pipeline built, and if the federal government proceeds with the imposition of a federal carbon tax on us, that we would be prepared to hold a referendum to delete Section 36 of the Constitution Act, the principle of equalization, concurrent with the 2021 October municipal elections. And so with this week's confirmation that the federal government intends to impose a cash grab on us through the federal carbon tax on January the 1st of next year, and the adoption of these 2 bills, both being a tax on our prosperity, this moves us much closer to greenlighting a referendum on equalization, because Albertans cannot be expected to continue to pay the freight in the Canadian Federation if the same federation continues to block our ability to develop and get a fair price for our resources. Happy to take your questions.
These developments are going to take some time to go down. You have options to take more immediate action, i.e. turn off the taps legislation. Are you considering, do you have other options, more immediate options, and would you consider something like turn off the taps?
Well, Bill 12, what you call the turn off the taps legislation is really deals specifically with, in principle, with British Columbia should they obstruct our energy. Obviously, it could be applied more broadly, and I would never rule that out. We won't start with that. I've always said that is kind of the final, one of the final reprisals in our toolbox. At this point, we'll be focusing on these constitutional challenges. But I think the biggest way of defending our interests is to put into play the whole question of equalization, through which is the biggest element of Alberta's $20 billion net contribution to the rest of the Federation through federal transfers. So those are the items that we'll be deploying immediately to register our profound disappointment at this betrayal of Alberta.
Premier, you said that this step brings us a little bit closer to a referendum on equalization.
I think I said a lot closer, but...
A lot closer to the referendum. What's going to be the immediate next thing you're watching out for? What's the next step that would bring us closer or much closer?
Well, the last criteria I laid out for holding a referendum on equalization would be the failure to get a coastal pipeline built. So, look, I'll be blunt. We hope that there will be a federal government this fall, after the fall election, that repeals Bills C-48 and C-69, that removes the threat of a federal carbon tax imposition on Alberta, and that does everything within its means to complete the Trans Mountain expansion. If we have a federal government that proceeds with these damaging bills, proceeds with the carbon tax threat, and doesn't do everything it can within its power to get Trans Mountain expansion done, then we will have a referendum on equalization in October of 2021. I hasten to add, as I've always done, that doesn't guarantee that we end equalization, which is not really actually my goal. I think Albertans are generous. They don't object to sharing some of our wealth with other parts of the country. But what it would do, in my view, is to elevate our fight for fairness to the top of the national agenda. In that sense, taking a page out of Quebec's political playbook. And I think Albertans expect us to do just that.
But when it comes to that, I mean, when the NDP introduced Bill 12, you made a fuss about them never intending to use it. You just say you don't even intend to or want to end it. How is this not the same thing that they did?
Well, first of all, they never proclaimed it into law. John Horgan came out of two meetings with Premier Notley saying that he had been assured that she did not intend to use it. Thirdly, I was consistent, Emma, through the debate on Bill 12 in the last legislature. Actually, I'll remind you that I was the one to first propose being prepared to turn off the taps in the summer of 2017. But I always said that would not be our first response. So let me just separate out the different issues. Today I'm talking primarily about the two bills that were passed in the Senate last night that will presumably become law this week, C-48 and C-69, dealing with the federal government's attacks on Alberta. And our response there will be a constitutional challenge as well as potentially a referendum on equalization. And our response to the senators from Alberta who voted against this province will be to hold Senate elections. In terms of the Bill 12, we've always conceived of that as being primarily about a potential response to a campaign of obstruction from British Columbia. And so I'll be meeting with Premier Horgan here in Edmonton next week at the margins of the Western Premiers Conference. I hope to get out to BC as well in July to have longer conversations with him. We'll be monitoring very closely what his government does to obstruct the Trans Mountain expansion. He says he's going to continue doing that. And as I said in the election and before it, we are looking at a graduated series of potential responses. We've always said that BC cannot launch a unilateral trade war against Alberta without a response. But the restricting the shipment of energy to protect its value would be a last and not a first response.
What's the point of Senate elections when the feds can do whatever they want?
Well, Emma, the point is, you're quite right. The Prime Minister and the Constitution has the unqualified power to appoint who he sees fit to the Senate. But Alberta brought this law in 1989 when the conventional wisdom was the idea of electing senators was crazy, but it created a political and democratic pressure on the federal government, which resulted in Brian Mulroney appointing Senator Stan Waters 30 years ago. And then, subsequent to that, 5 other elected senators were appointed by prime ministers. So we cannot compel a prime minister to appoint our preferred candidate to the Senate, but we can certainly submit a list of people who have been chosen by Alberta voters and then basically challenge a prime minister to ignore democracy. That might happen, but at least we would have a list of people ready to roll for a government that's committed to Senate democracy.
Hi, Dean, just before...
Sorry, I'll take Dean and then we'll go to the... Go ahead.
A change in government, of course, would be the fastest solution to a lot of these problems. You've already said that you're going to campaign. Are you going to, as a result of this, perhaps redouble your campaign efforts or bring other forces to bear in the federal campaign?
Well, Dean, I said very clearly in the past several months that if the Trudeau government stays committed to this path of attacking Alberta with bills like 48 and 69, the federal carbon tax, and surrender on so many other prospective pipelines, if they continue in that path, then I think the re-election of the Trudeau government would be devastating for the economic future of Alberta. And I will not hesitate to make that case. Right now, I have had very direct conversations with the Prime Minister about this, about these bills, about our concerns that are shared by 8 other provinces. It appears that he's chosen to ignore the concerns of, by the way, this is not a partisan thing. I want to remind you, the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party of Alberta, the Alberta Party, representing 98% of Alberta voters, I think share the concerns about these 2 bills. So I think I speak on behalf of the overwhelming majority of Albertans in saying that these bills are an affront to this province. And I will not hesitate to carry that message to Alberta voters and voters in the other parts of the country, should it be necessary. Right now, we're focused on getting our agenda done here, and we're not in the federal election yet. But I will certainly, if the federal government continues in this direction, raise the concerns of this province in a vigorous way.
Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
Our first question comes from Jason Markisoff of Maclean's. Your line is open.
Hi, Mr. Kenney. This week, Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader, put out an energy platform which discusses a new federal regime for large emitters. Do you have concerns that will trample on Alberta's jurisdiction?
No, I think the federal, because it sounds like it will be largely complementary to our own. We would expect the federal government to work with provinces who have their own systems for levies on major industrial emissions. So actually, I think our policies sound very complementary. There might be some details that need to be ironed out. We would obviously expect a federal government with Mr. Scheer's proposed policy to work with like-minded provinces. And that's broadly, Jason, the policy approach of the governments of New Brunswick, Ontario, and Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So, I think we actually see a growing alignment across the Federation that Mr. Scheer's policy reflects, that major industrial emitters should play a part through a tariff like that to fund research and development that shrinks carbon intensity and which is can be commercialized and exported around the world. So, Jason, I would just add that, in fact, we are working with the Federal Environment Department right now on the details about the coordination between our tier fund and their tax on major emitters. So even under the current government, there is, at the technical level, some cooperation on that.
Do you have a follow-up, Jason?
Actually, I did just follow up on that point you just made. Are there discussions about keeping something that's closer to what the NDP the current program is, and not having it quite at the level that you specifically promised in your platform, i.e., the lowering the tonnage rate from $30 to $20?
Yes, there is some flexibility in our part, and we'll be discussing that with industry. I indicated to the Prime Minister that we have some flexibility about that, and this is really the point, Jason. I don't appreciate the kind of confrontational language from Minister McKenna when they have a number of provinces that are willing to meet them at least halfway on when it comes to industrial emissions. So we'll keep an open mind about that. We do, as I've said, Jason, we do take seriously the challenge of reducing emissions. We think targeting major industrial emissions is a lot more effective and a lot fairer than punishing just ordinary folks for heating their homes. And so we'll happily work with whoever's in the federal government constructively on a sensible policy to charge major emitters for carbon emissions.
All right, we have time for one more question from the floor.
On Bill C-48, you referenced that the vote was very, very close in the Senate, and which kind of indicates that it is a very divisive bill. Is that something you can make as a legal argument or even as a political or moral argument to Ottawa to say, maybe you should reconsider this?
I don't think it's a legal argument, but it certainly is a political argument. It came super close, and I want to thank the 46 frankly brave senators for willing to challenge a bill being thrown back at them from the House of Commons. I thank the 5 Alberta senators who voted that way, and I would appeal yet again to Prime Minister Trudeau. Look, you've got what's the point here? I was just in the Bay of Fundy a week ago today at the largest oil refinery in the world that offloads about 200,000 barrels per day from super tankers coming from Saudi Arabia. You're not imposing a ban on the Bay of Fundy. You're not posing a ban on the tankers that come down the Gulf of St. Lawrence. You'd shut down the Quebec economy if you did. So why is it just a ban on Alberta exports? This is why you have a Senate committee, the majority of whom are not Conservatives, voted to delete the bill. And now nearly half the Senate, 49% of the Senate voted against it. So we'd ask them to reconsider. Folks, I've got a roundtable upstairs. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.